The Holy Gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ according to St. Matthew.
Glory to you, Lord Christ.
Jesus taught, "You have heard that it was said to the people long ago, 'You shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment.' But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, 'Racha,' is answerable to the court. And anyone who says 'you fool' will be in danger of the fire of hell. Therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to them, then come and offer your gift. Settle matters quickly with your adversary who's taking you to court. Do it while you are still together on the way, or your adversary may hand you over to the judge, and the judge may hand you over to the officer, and you may be thrown into prison. Truly, I tell you, you will not get out until you've paid the last penny. You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. It has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, makes her the victim of adultery. And anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
In the name of God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Please be seated. Well, Jesus was coming in hot this morning. Or was it just me? Yikes. But the good news we encounter in this scripture today is that Jesus lays out a vision for us to become a presence of righteousness and safety in our personal relationships and in his church, and we can attain this vision through him. Well, last Sunday, we jumped a week ahead in the lectionary to a section near the beginning of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. There, he was casting a vision for the life of righteousness he wants to lead us into, meaning a life where we do right by others. We treat and engage them with the love that God has for them and what they deserve as his children. Well, today we've picked up right where we left off in Matthew 5, still a week ahead in the lectionary. Here, Jesus is continuing to cast that vision for us, but in some particular concrete ways that he would have us engage with others differently from the world, the ways of the world. Now, even before Jesus came, God had already begun laying out this vision of righteousness back in the 10 Commandments that we read this morning, that he gave to Israel through Moses. But the reality was that the 10 Commandments alone were not sufficient for helping God's people to live righteously. Because the 10 Commandments are primarily focused on people's external behaviors, at least the first 9, without adequately addressing people's inner life or their hearts. After all, it is our spiritual hearts, meaning our will and desires, where all of our sin springs from in the first place, right? So what we see Jesus doing in today's passage is turning our attention toward our inner lives, because it's only when we allow the Lord to shine his light there that we can truly begin to grow in righteousness, to love others as Christ does in our attitudes and actions. The good news is that Jesus lays out a vision for us to become a presence of righteousness and safety, I would say, in our personal relationships and in his church. And this is something we can attain only through him. That's what he's up to in our passage today. But in order to see this in our passage today, there's a good bit I need to clarify. We just sang about ancient words, and sometimes ancient words don't quite add up for us, right? There's a lot of historical context that makes their meaning actually be quite different than what it might seem when we just read it superficially. So today I'm going to draw on different folks, Dallas Willard, Cloud and Townsend Bible Project, N.T. Wright, to uncover some of those meanings. What we'll see is Jesus taking a few of the 10 Commandments, but taking them to that deeper level, a deeper level, by considering them from the perspective of our inner lives. And he begins with the 6th commandment, thou shalt not murder. Thou shalt not murder. Jesus teaches, you've heard it said to the people long ago, to the Israelites, you shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, Racha, is answerable to the court, and anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of the fire of hell. So those are some serious things to say that we'll get to, but let's say that Jesus has taken the sin of murder down to its root. And that root is the inner disposition of anger, of holding on to anger. And it's true. If you think about it, literally no one has ever committed murder without first being angry. I mean, I try to imagine a scenario where, no one commits murder without first being angry. However, it is critical for us to understand that anger itself is not a sin. The emotion of anger is not a sin. Anger is the emotion that comes up in us when we perceive someone is treating us or treating someone else unrighteously. Anger alerts us to this so we can decide whether we need to impose a boundary, put a stop to it. Right? So anger itself is not sin. A lot of churches can teach, at least implicitly, because they don't do good exegesis, that emotions are sin, and that is bonkers and from the pit of hell. God created us with emotions, right? I printed from Ephesians 4 in your bulletin. Paul clearly makes a distinction between anger and sin itself. He says, in your anger, don't sin. In other words, you're going to get angry. Just when you do, don't indulge it sinfully. So where we come up to the line of sin is when anger arises in us and we have a decision to make about what we're going to do with that anger. Now, a righteous response to our emotion of anger, depending on the situation, might be to forgive the offender, right? Especially if it's something little, right? But when it's something of some significance or that's repeatedly happened, it might be to share with that person who's provoked anger in us about how they've affected us. Of course, only when it's safe and actually possible to do so. Or another healthy response can be to put in a boundary where one's needed. Sometimes we need all of these responses together. But all too often, we respond to our anger sinfully by choosing to embrace it and even to act in it, on it. This is what Jesus means when he says anyone who's angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. This is not merely having the emotion of anger, but embracing unforgiveness and resentment. And when we embrace unforgiveness and resentment, the impulse to then retaliate is always on deck, right? We've embraced it. We're ticked, right? And we're going for it. We're going to indulge that anger. What's on deck? How might we retaliate, right? So he gives some verbal ways we might retaliate, right? Because it doesn't always go all the way to murder, right? He says when we speak to somebody saying racha or you fool, he's talking about retaliating verbally by calling someone worthless. By saying, that was the equivalent in those days of saying you're worthless. Racha is a way to say you're a nothing. You are nothing. In Jesus' day, calling someone a fool, like to us, it's like, man, I don't even know if that's wrong. Well, yeah. But in that day, that was like calling somebody a bleeping bleep bleep. I'm telling you, right? That was essentially cursing somebody, right? So we may have heard it said on the schoolyard, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. Jesus is disagreeing. And Jesus is right. I mean, think about every single one of us can remember words spoken to us decades ago that hit us like, right? I mean, take your sticks and stones over there, right? He's saying when we indulge our anger in a way that isn't to the level of physical violence, we can still cause and are causing significant damage to both the person we're doing it against and to ourselves. Now, thank goodness that we have forgiveness through Christ, right? For all of the ways we have broken this command. But remember, Jesus teaches, even though we're forgiven, he teaches us about sin. He teaches about sin for a purpose, right? What constitutes sin is not just this arbitrary line. No, God in his love for humanity wants to protect us from the harm that sin will inevitably cause us and others, whether we recognize it or not. So what's actually harmful then about indulging anger in these ways? Well, most often we use anger to control people, right? Or we indulge anger to control people. We perceive anger, expressing anger at someone, as an easy way to get things done, in particular what we want done, right? And so we use words of anger or even just a harsh look to get people to comply with what we want them to do. Or if we've lashed out at them enough, it doesn't even take a word or a look, right? The fear of our anger, if we're kind of an angry person, or you tend to use that on them, the fear can often be enough. But what using anger like this communicates is that our selfish goals, our will being done, is more important than they are as a human being. What we want done, we might even think is like exactly what God wishes for the person, right? God doesn't control people. But even if that's the case, if we're going to use anger to get there, we're saying what we want done is more important than them as a human being and them being able to exercise their agency, right? Of course, with kids in an age-appropriate way. And when we act this way toward people, it is toxic to their souls and our soul, right? It doesn't only victimize others, we victimize ourselves. When Jesus says at the end of verse 22, that anyone who treats someone as worthless will be in danger of the fire of hell, I guess I have a little good news, that he isn't actually talking about the afterlife here. Or if he is, it's secondary, and we need to remember his grace, right? The word translated hell here is actually a literal place called Gehenna. That's the Greek word, Gehenna. It's on the south side of Jerusalem, and some really bad stuff had happened there. It's called the Valley of Ben Hinnom, and kind of got changed in the Greek to Gehenna. And I don't want to get too deep in the weeds here, but the historic significance of this valley is that it was a place where God's people committed atrocities, like awful, awful things, the worst things they'd done, basically sacrificing their babies to some false gods, okay? And then later, in that very valley, they experienced God's punishment. It was like an inversion punishment, right? You do this awful thing, and then you experience the awful thing in the exact geographic place, just so we're clear what this is about, what this punishment's about, right? So by citing this place, this is Jesus' creative way of teaching that the more we indulge our anger and become angrier people, we are making a living hell for ourselves. It may feel like it gets something done in the short term, but it's toxic to us, right? What they say about resentment, it's like drinking poison, expecting the other person to get poisoned or whatever. I'm sure they'd say it better, right? I love the way Bible Project summarizes Jesus' sort of whole warning. He says, if you're going to bring fire and destruction to others, that fire will be the thing that ultimately undoes you. Right? But as we all know, it's one thing to have a vision for how indulging anger is wrong, or how to respond to our anger righteously, right? Turn to the Lord, forgiving, being honest where it's appropriate, putting in boundaries, all that. It's one thing to know that. It's a whole nother thing to make that choice when the kids just won't get in the car. Sorry, I'm single parenting this weekend. I find when I'm preaching on something, God sometimes likes to give me a little taste of, so that I have empathy, right, for all of us. So it's a whole other thing when we're in the thick of it, right? But the reality is that our sin is more powerful than us. We've got to recognize that, right? We cannot overcome our sin sickness on our own. If we could, we would have never needed Jesus, right? Only He is stronger than our sin. And so when we find ourselves angry at somebody, or when we realize we've already crossed the line into resentment and revenge, the best thing we can do is turn to the Lord, name it before Him, admit to Him our powerlessness over it, and then ask God to take it away. Ask Him to give us the grace to forgive. Ask Him to give us discernment about what we need to do about it. Maybe there is something we need to do, right? Such as be honest or ask forgiveness if we've already retaliated, right? Again, He really is. It's not funny, actually, that Jesus gives me these similar tests throughout the week before I preach on it. But the other day I realized, like, somebody ticked me off, right? And I had the thought, like, it's because you're not even thinking. And I was just like, it was just getting me it was toxic to me, right? And it just occurred to me, wait a second. I could actually just forgive them here. And I would feel better, right? And I did, and I was better. Now, I'm not saying everything is always that easy and transactional, right? This was not a big thing. But when it's not enough, when it is sort of a big thing, a next step is to turn to another believer for help, right? They may be able to empathize with us. Sometimes that's what we need, just to be seen, like that we really were wronged or whatever. Or they might be able to give us a different perspective that allows us to view the situation in a different way, because our perspective is limited. We have all sorts of blind spots, particularly when it comes to things that make us angry. Or they may even help us to discover that what has us angry in that moment really is not about the person who offended us in that moment at all. It's about something else, right, that they triggered in us. So the good news is Jesus lays out a vision for us to become a presence of righteousness and safety in our personal relationships and in His church, which we can only attain through Him. Now, I know I've already talked about a lot here, but there's a lot of stuff I can't really just leave hanging out there read in this gospel passage. So let's go ahead and talk about sex, okay? Might as well, right? We're all here. Let's go for it. The other commandment Jesus takes to a deeper level is that seventh commandment: you shall not commit adultery. So this is a prohibition against having sex outside of the covenant of marriage. But in verse 27, Jesus teaches, you have heard it said, you shall not commit adultery, but I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Now, I should say that if Jesus' phrasing here seems a bit one-sided from a gender perspective, he's not meaning to suggest that women are immune from lust. Rather, we should remember that Jesus is giving this Sermon on the Mount to His inner circle of 12 disciples, who are all men. Okay? But Jesus has taken this commandment on adultery to its root, which is the inner disposition of lust. Again, though, it's critical for us to understand that there's a difference between lust and just a feeling of sexual desire or attraction arising in us, right? Sexual desire is a God-given instinct, right? So simply having sexual desire or attraction arise in us, come into our heads, come into our hearts, that in itself is not a sin. Verse 28 is translated well. It's not actually translated this way in every Bible. Thankfully, the NIV gets it right. It's not that noticing another person as sexually attractive is a sin. It's taking that next step of lustful intent, of fantasy or covetousness, right? We know sexual desire is not sin, even though the church has gotten this wrong a good bit throughout history, right? Rather, it's a gift for a husband and wife to celebrate and to deepen their bond together, and of course, potentially to reproduce and have children. And so it's beyond that boundary of that appropriate context for sexual desire to be exercised where we're going to be causing harm. And what is the harm? The harm of lust, whether it's from fantasy or covetousness, to using pornography, all the way to physical adultery, the harm of all of that is that we are taking something that is not ours. We're taking something that is not ours. Lusting after someone objectifies them, essentially saying, you are here for me, for my use. That's your purpose in the world, right? And lust is the opposite, therefore, of love, because it disregards God's best for that person, right? And the best for them sexually is to only be engaged with sexually within the trust and safety and commitment of the marriage covenant, right? But lust is also never private. Even if one's lust is completely seeming to stay in their imagination or in the privacy of their own home or computer screen, it still objectifies certain people. And that is going to spill out in all sorts of toxic ways when we do engage similar people who we're in relationship with or community with. Now again, thank goodness we have forgiveness through Christ for all the ways we may have broken this command. However, Jesus, coming in hot, his suggestion for us to deal with any lust is disturbing, to say the least. He teaches if your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off. Y'all heard it, right? Oh, except I want to highlight the end of that. Better to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell, right? Same hell concept as the anger thing, right? We're not actually talking primarily about the afterlife here. We're talking about making a living hell for ourselves. The more we lust, the more we burn up in lust, right? But what does Jesus mean, though, with this metaphor of the eye and the hand? Well, scholar Lucy Pepiot points out that the eye and the hand are not only the two primary means by which a human takes something. Again, lust is taking something that's not ours. The eye and hand are also the two of the most indispensable parts of a functioning human life. For example, if you had to choose, I think I have this right, just a guess. If you had to choose between keeping your hand or your foot, which one are you going to pick? I'm picking the hand, right? If you had to choose between keeping your sense of sight or your sense of smell, or even your sense of hearing, which are you going to pick, right? I'm keeping sight, right? I doubt I'm alone in that, right? So what Jesus really means with this metaphor, right, he's doing a little double meaning there, of course, with the taking, but is that if we grasp the seriousness of the impact that lust has on us and on others, we will want to go to any means necessary to put that sin to death in ourselves with the help of God and others, right? And this really applies to both issues. I left something out, I want to say it. So there's a few people who have actually taken this verse literally in history. Don't recommend it, right? Literally gouge out their eye or cut off their hand, right? Why do we know Jesus isn't saying that? Because you could do that and still lust, right? I mean, it's a heart thing. Anyway, as far as going to any means necessary, this really applies to both issues Jesus is addressing here, both lust and anger, because the steps toward overcoming lust are really similar to anger, right? We start with admitting to God our powerlessness over that lust and ask him to remove it from our hearts for that time. Although I want to add a parallel strategy, which is to pray for that person you're tempted to lust after. It's actually hard to pray for someone and lust after them at the same time. So that's sort of a similar way to turn to God in it, right? But then in instances when none of that's enough, which can certainly happen, that temptation or that sin continues to rage within us, we can look to another for help. Their empathy or their insight, or frankly just connecting with another human in an appropriate way, right? That's actually often the need, the unaddressed need underneath lust, is a lack of appropriate, healthy connection, with another human being. That's actually usually the godly desire that's being distorted and playing out in lust. It's by taking steps like these that we can go to any lengths necessary to not succumb to the living hell of being consumed by wrath or lust, not to mention being hell for those around us. Being hell for those around us. These are ways we can be prepared to respond when anger and lust arises, and we're going to need them, what I've talked about. But instead of just making our aim to not be harmful, right? What if instead we focused on the capacity we have to be a blessing? Sort of instead of playing defense, playing offense, or just being, having a positive vision, right? Putting our focus there and on the potential that each of us have to create relationships and environments of safety for others. Safety from toxicity like anger and lust. Right? When we're able to do that, insofar as we have the power in a relationship, in a community, we are giving a gift to allow people then to be freely themselves and not have to live on the defense or not taking them into something that's unhealthy, right? And when we don't do that, we're missing out on the good that God intends them to be for us, right? What happens when we use anger to control our spouse or our friend or our family member is that we create an environment where it is unsafe for them to be themselves, right? So the potential for that interaction or that relationship for that time, the potential for it to be a blessing is totally doused, right? We may keep them in line, but emotionally they're shutting down, right? Or when we engage another person but are filled with lust toward them or others, they're not going to be able to safely engage us in the manner of blessing that God intended. And people intuit more than we might think, right? And sadly, these dynamics are only amplified when in situations where we have more power than the other. So when we use anger in parenting or toward an employee under us, when we use anger to control at the expense of emotional safety, the potential for us to be a blessing to that person under our authority, that potential is going to plummet. They're just going to be trying to survive. Again, don't forget the grace. If you're self-condemning, don't forget the grace of Jesus. Right? doesn't say this to condemn us. He's calling us into something he wants to help us with, right? But that power thing is key to, just kind of touch on it. In verse 31, Jesus addresses this question of divorce. And man, that's a deep thing to get into. There's lots of scriptures. But in the hypothetical, he frames it as the man divorcing the woman. And this is because it was common practice in Judaism for men to divorce their wives for any reason whatsoever, right? Some thought it was just for infidelity, that it was okay. Others, lady burns the toast, she's out, right? I'm not joking. I don't think that's too hyperbolic, right? Think of that disposition of the husband toward the wife there. Discarding her is valueless. Really, at the core, believing my wife is here for me, right? There's a narcissism, right? You say, well, again, why is he picking on men? Well, it's a little different today, right? Women have more capacity to do the same in a marriage, but those days, no. Right? A woman didn't want to get divorced. It meant she was going to be poor or worse, right? So it's not this imbalanced in our day, right? When the man embraced that dynamic, though, of she better do everything I want her to do and better do it right, just think about that dynamic in a relationship. Both of them. Like he thinks he's winning there? No. Both of them are going to miss out on the blessing of marriage altogether from the jump. If you enter the marriage that way, it's going to be a nightmare. It's going to be a living hell for everybody, right? If the man's intent on being a selfish husband, they'll never have a prayer of enjoying the deeper blessings God had for that marriage covenant. So there may be some situations where there's a difference in power, right? Where we actually have a greater impact that we can have than someone who we're mutual with. But the larger vision for us to catch today, as I'm closing up, y'all have been really patient. It's a lot to take in. The larger vision for us to catch is to make it our mission in every relationship and community that we're a part of to be a presence of safety. What if that's just the vision? Be thou my vision, Lord. That was his vision, right? Just to be a presence of safety. Through God's help, to engage people righteously, even in our hearts, right? By when it's coming up in there saying, Lord, I sense that, but I want to help, give me your eyes for this person, right? And not living like everybody is there for us, right? This is how Jesus entered every interaction he had, seeking to provide emotional safety and, of course, engage righteously with others. And that freed people to be who they truly were with him, where they truly were at. Even if they were at a place that was not totally righteous, right? He could bring it out. They could finally get real, right? And he wants to help us do the same. The good news is that Jesus lays out a vision for us to become a presence of righteousness and safety in our personal relationships, including in this church. And we can get there. We can become that. We can grow in that as far as we are willing to follow Jesus into that. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.